Hi class, Nicole here, and I'm excited to talk to you about this week's discussion questions involving globalization. So let's get started. In response to the first discussion question, why does the overall index of globalization seem to be rising over time? Well, the Koff index of globalization measures the rate of globalization in countries around the world. The rise in the overall index is indicative of how globally interconnected we are in terms of three dimensions, which you see here in this chart: economic, political, and social. This number keeps rising over time as the world becomes more integrated and interdependent in these dimensions. For example, consider the economic dimension. The more we interact and participate in trade integration and create revenue flows, the more effect we have on this aspect of the index. Even when we factor more trade and capital restrictions, those also impact the overall connection with foreign countries. As we increase areas in trade, communication channels, and/or technology with other foreign markets, the more connected we become. Our text outlines how over the years countries across the world experienced rising incomes and increased economic growth as they became more connected across the world. As we increase in activities that impact these three dimensions, an overall rise in the index of globalization can result. In my research, I found it pretty interesting that the rise of index was described as stagnant as of 2015 through 2018 per recent data from the Koff Swiss Economic Institute. Their site stated economic globalization flattened due to declined trade integration. Social and political globalization increased just slightly, and I found it pretty interesting. So if anyone in the class has any thoughts on this as to why this might have happened or done research in the news somehow, I definitely would be curious to know. Question 2 asks which of the main forces seems to be driving globalization. While the combination of forces listed in figure 12.1 are all really impactful in driving globalization, if I had to choose one force as a major influencer of globalization, it would be capital. Capital really captures actual flows of trade, foreign direct investment, as well as restrictions applying to these flows, currency speculation, and sovereign wealth funds. When companies are driven to operate on an international scale, oftentimes the driving force behind the decision involves wealth or investment in wealth, expansion, and growth. Companies want to increase market sales and profits, advance trade with other countries, as well as seek ways to build financial strength. Economic expansion can be the spark that really drives the company into a new business venture, as there are opportunities in these emerging markets. When we think of capital as a driving force involving trade, we can consider how some nations depend on imports only to survive economically versus other countries on a larger or more developed scale who believe in exports. Ultimately, I think the initial act in desiring to take part in a lucrative global market to build upon capital is a major driver of globalization. 3, asking us to declare a winner or a loser in globalization, I would actually argue that there's a middle ground where there are benefits for both parties involved. For instance, when we consider the benefit of increased interconnectedness that comes from globalization and the impact that might have on both large and small countries, one might have more of an impact or benefit than the other, but I wouldn't necessarily call that losing if the other party still has something to gain. Countries, regardless of developed or emerging nations, can reap economic rewards from this. However, if we're looking at who benefits more or wins more as opportunities are not evenly dispersed, I would say developed nations benefit more from globalization, as their economies are stronger, stable, more advanced, and have the ability to profit more due to the large capabilities and resources of a developed country. Poor, underdeveloped countries that are the least globalized tend to be left behind, as there's a wide gap in the per capita income versus a globalized country. According to GED, industrialized countries continue to be the biggest winners of increasing globalization, while developing and emerging economies lag behind. To address the last question, I personally do not oppose globalization, but do feel it's valuable to understand and hear the voices of anti-globalization groups, I can't imagine what the world would be like today without continued global interconnectedness. As we read in our text, open global markets create opportunities for efficiencies, increased economic health, consumer benefits, and has resulted in overall financial gains. It also allows for the opportunity to knowledge share between countries, which I feel is extremely valuable. Yet even with all of these positives comes new risks and vulnerabilities that are currently being actively opposed by groups who are against globalization. Just to name a few standpoints of anti-globalization groups, they tend to believe that globalization leads to a loss of jobs, ecological problems, economic stagnation, and increased competition. In a way, I do believe that these groups should be able to voice their opinions and be publicly heard. I also believe that their concerns about globalization should be thoroughly looked at and addressed by governments involved. However, the minute these protests turn violent, any solid message that they are trying to convey ends up taking a backseat in the spotlight, which becomes counterproductive to their end goal. I'm never one to condone or encourage any type of violent protest. There is never a time or a place for violence, and find it discouraging that others feel inclined to implement forceful tactics in their approach. I mean, there are countless anti-globalization protests across the web showcasing aggressive protests that leave cities just completely destroyed, demolished, and people really in a lot of pain. I do understand that there are risks and implications that need to be considered when further dissecting the pros and cons of globalization. However, maybe a better approach is finding ways to better deal with and prepare for the impacts of globalization. Really, protesting groups should consider the most effective way to spread a message. So I know that was a lot, so thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I definitely look forward to your thoughts and further discussion around what I had to say for this week's post. Other than that, have a great week.